Ladies and gentlemen, hello. My name is Nick Childs. I'm the Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security here at the IISS, and I'd like to welcome you to the first plenary session of the first Sea Lord Sea Power Conference 2021 with the title of The Maritime Domain in a Competitive Age. We've had a great overview start to proceedings with keynote addresses both from the Secretary of State and from the First Sea Lord himself, and a first, I think, with a live link to HMS Queen Elizabeth and Commodore Steve Morehouse at sea as the ship and its group prepares for its operational debut out to the Indo-Pacific and back. The theme and the title for this session, The Maritime Domain in a Competitive Age, I think gets to one of the key themes of both the condition of the maritime domain at the moment and the both opportunities and challenges for naval forces and maritime security and the domain in general. And what we'll be looking for here is the broad strategic context, I think, of global competition and what that means and its implications for the maritime domain, including operationally. We have a great cast list of panelists who I shall invite in turn to make short opening remarks. It's a crowded panel, so I'll obviously keep introductions pretty brief. And you in the audience also already have the speaker bios in the delegate packs. I remind you when we come to the question and answer at the end of the opening remarks of the options for intervening in the discussion to ask a question or make an intervention, either using the raised hand function or the question and answer function that's available. I would remind everyone that this whole session, including the question and answer period, is on the record. And with that, I'd like to turn to provide his perspective, I think, on the geostrategic context that I talked about, Angus Lapsley, who is the Director General Strategy and International at the UK Ministry of Defence, who is with us here in Arundel House. So Angus, turn it over to you.
Look, I was one of those people very closely involved in the pulling together of the integrated review that Britain brought out earlier in the year. So I thought I would just sort of start by saying why I think it was that maritime power kept coming back to the heart of that review, and why I think it's going to be so important to what Britain does with its allies in defence over the next period of time. So, if you look at the key messages in the integrated review, there was obviously a message about the world becoming a more competitive place. There was a message about the UK needing to invest in tooling up to deal with that more competitive space. And then it had a number of key messages about what parts of the world matter to us and why. So if you start with that, we made very clear in the integrated review that the security of Europe and our commitment to NATO and the North Atlantic Alliance was a foundation of Britain's security and of a more global role. And when you think about it, actually maritime power remains absolutely fundamental to how NATO works. When you look at the map, Europe is actually, it's a big peninsula. It's surrounded by seas and oceans, except for on the eastern flank. And I think there are at least 4 core ways in which maritime power is going to remain critical to NATO, and Britain's role within that will remain central. So the first, which First Sea Lord mentioned earlier, is the maintenance of deterrence and the continuous at-sea deterrence, which is critical for Britain and America and for France in very similar ways. Secondly, maintaining the freedom of movement across the Atlantic to allow reinforcements and the flow of material across the Atlantic. Thirdly, the ability to conduct littoral maneuver around the flanks of Europe. And for Britain, looking, for example, at the High North at the moment and the ability to operate around Norway, or indeed looking at the Black Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean. And then fourthly, the maritime domain provides you with lots of flexible options for strike. and the fact that Britain has moved back into a carrier strike role with the ability to stand off and hit targets from a long distance away, I think is a really significant part. And it's something which America and France obviously offer to NATO as well. So I think the first thing to say is that maritime power is going to remain critical to what NATO is all about, just as it was in NATO's predecessors, the Anglo-American alliance of the 1940s. Secondly, and this is obviously brought out a lot in this morning's discussion, it's critical to a global role for Britain. And that is obviously partly about the Indo-Pacific and being more present there, maintaining a persistent presence, but also a surge presence. But there's quite a few parts of the world we haven't talked about yet this morning in which maritime power will remain critical. A presence in the Gulf, being able to operate on the African littorals, the Gulf of Guinea, for example, or the east coast of Africa, and the Caribbean, a part of the world that still matters a lot to Britain and France and the Netherlands and one or two other European countries as well. So I think the global picture it's not just about Indo-Pacific. It's quite complicated actually, and it's really important. I think there is a big maritime component of another message in the integrated review, which is our ability to work with allies and to offer something that allies find useful to plug into and play with. And you really see that with carrier strike, but you see it also with the amphibious role we have, or it might in many cases be a question of capacity building with allies and partners. So it may not be that visible, but for example, the work we're doing with Ukraine at the moment to help them think through what kind of maritime role they want to play in the Black Sea and how we can help them build their capacity. And then I suppose lastly, I would just sort of touch on, again, it's what I hope we'll get into the conversation about this, about what's maritime's role in what you might call grey zone competition. And I think, for me, the core thing here is that maritime forces tend to be inherently flexible. You can move them in and out of somewhere, depending on when you want to be sending a message and when you want to be deliberately stepping back. But you can also dial up and dial down what kind of posture they have and how threatening or how reassuring you want them to be at any one time. So there's quite a big difference between sending an OPV somewhere to do some capacity building as an act of presence or an act of engagement from, for example, letting it be known that a submarine is in the region or a Type 45 destroyer or whatever. And that inherent flexibility in maritime forces, I think, is something which, as a policymaker, you find rather attractive because it gives you options for maintaining deterrence, building engagement, and sending strategic messages short of entering into conflict. And I suppose the very last theme that I thought came out of the integrated review a lot is that word integrated. So I think navies provide you with a really good platform for integrating across government. And I've been leading preparations across government on CSG 21, and having our trade experts, our foreign policy experts, even sometimes our cultural policy experts, all contributing to what you can do with this CSG really brings that home. But it's also a force that maritime forces can also be a real driver of integration at the military level. I mean, the CSG story, of course, is also a story of the RAF and their capability development. But over time, I think you will see more and more instances where, actually all three of our services are operating in a fully integrated way with things like carrier strike. So I think for me, those are the themes that just kept coming back in the integrated review and why you see such an emphasis on this domain.
Let's move swiftly on, and I'll turn to Samantha Jobe, who will, I think, provide a slightly different perspective, but on the same territory, perhaps. Samantha is Director for Defence and International Security at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And Samantha, the floor is yours.
You may be wondering why you have a speaker from FCDO on the panel, but it's for the reasons that you have just heard. When we think about the UK internationally, the UK is seen in the round. Everything that we do, all the different levers of government are speak to what the government as a whole is trying to do. And as Angus said, those of us who have been through a process of preparing the integrated review, was a deliberate and conscious theme, that integration. How do we make sure that all the different activities that government is engaged in nationally and internationally add up to greater than the sum of their parts? And I will start with a thought from a non-technical specialist, which is to everyone on this call, there is a subtlety between different forms of maritime and naval power. In my world, if you talk to a journalist, you're always a British warship. And what is the British warship doing? Add your geography. And the reason I mentioned the maritime domain as part of that international reach, that global diplomatic effort. And hard power is absolutely part of our international posture. There is no question. And it is embodied very visibly in the maritime domain. But I'd also argue that the maritime power naval projection is part of our soft power in the same way. That sort of brand that is the UK, that promotes the international agenda of the UK. And there are three themes to that. The first, as you have just heard, is how is the UK going to be postured in that greater geostrategic competition? And it is with allies and it is with partners. And this is a domain in which we do that extremely well. Secondly, there is a prosperity agenda for the UK. As we act internationally, we want to be building relationships for trade and prosperity and economic growth for both partners as well. And thirdly, and you'll hear the Foreign Secretary talk about this a lot, and it's an international force for good agenda. So I thought I would try and jot down on the back of an envelope in which ways I have seen maritime activity support that broader international agenda. I thought I would try to get to 10. I got to 11 without thinking. So I'll give you some of these. They're in no particularly glamorous order, but as an illustration, we have naval assets involved in crisis response. On one level, that can be British nationals evacuated from a conflict zone. I've seen that in my career. Crisis response in the form of hurricane relief, assistance to our overseas territories and to others has been critical again. How about international law? One of the big things that we stand up for, democratic values, the legal frameworks, the international rule of law. That could be freedom of navigation activity. It could be counter-piracy activity. It could be capacity building activity. We're doing work with Southeast Asian nations on understanding maritime domain awareness, helping them increase their capabilities. What other fields have we got? Well, let's come back to prosperity. Freedom of navigation absolutely supports for prosperity. Then there is what we like to call diplomacy convening power. Diplomats like a ship's visit. Sorry to be so prosaic about it, but the opportunity and the occasion can be magnified so that we can use convening power to access diplomatic and prosperity relationships that we collectively want to develop. And then there's an angle about democracy to me. Having the British Armed Forces demonstrating what democratically accountable armed forces look and feel like is all part of our soft power projection of our values globally with our partners. There's also UK as a reliable partner, and that's absolutely some of what the interoperability of the CSG is going to demonstrate, that we can work closely with others, we can support others, and we can work together on greater goals. There are other angles to the international law aspect of this, like sanctions enforcement. It's a very concrete piece of activity which we couldn't do without that maritime capability. However much we talk about these things in diplomacy, making them real is something that we're doing with you. And then there's another sort of prosperity, which is capability development and defence sales, and how we can use your strengths in the industrial side to build partnerships with other countries as well. And I did all of that without talking about the domestic agenda around security of our own sort of sea space, whether that's illegal migration or dare I say, fishing. You know, it's really clear to me that in almost every sphere of activity that we are promoting through the integrated review, there is a maritime element. So there is a lot for you to think through today beyond the hard power part of the capability. I would just say, though, that diplomacy, if that's what I'm here to represent, is not being nice to people for the sake of it. Diplomacy is for creating effect. And we do have done a lot of thought about what effects, and we are doing a lot of thought about what effects we want to have in different geographies. And there's a maritime component to a lot of those geographies, as you've just heard Angus outline, but you don't need me to tell you. All of those policies need to be part of an integrated whole across government about how we create that effect. So to come back to my opening point, the thought I would sort of leave you with, the message for today is, what are you part of? And what are you seeking to achieve, with whom, to what effect, for HMG or HMG and our partners acting internationally when we do that? Thank you very much.
Samantha, thank you very much for that, for adding that perspective, and glad to see you got to 11 on the rheostat as far as the shopping list of requirements is concerned. That from both Angus and Samantha, we've heard the attractiveness of the inherent flexibility of naval forces and maritime forces, to some extent from the consumer's point of view, although we are talking about it all being integrated, so consumers and producers may be slightly too binary. But I am going to change the focus yet again by bringing in as an operator with an operator's perspective to add to the mix, the fleet commander for the Royal Navy, Vice Admiral Jerry Kidd. So Jerry, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Nick. I hope you can hear me all right.
Absolutely, yes. See you here.
Good stuff. Well, good morning to you all, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak in Plenary 1. It's a great pleasure to do so, particularly as Steve Morehouse, who spoke to us earlier, is just arriving over my shoulder here back in Portsmouth. And if there's ever a metaphor for example of 21st century British sea power coming back to life, it's that group right behind me now. It's truly awesome. Look, having heard from the context from Angus and Samantha there, we all acknowledge that we're in an era of global persistent competition between states, and we have a whole host of other security worries, and it seems that demand is absolutely going to outstrip our capacity to deliver. So it's right now, from my side as Fleet Commander, we analyse how best to leave our maritime flank, not least recasting what sea power means from a strategic perspective, but also how it knits and supports the wider cross-government architecture that Samantha touched on there. But from my side, this is driving the Royal Navy to really refresh its operational construct, its mindset, and I have to say, its intellectual thinking. And I think for the first time, perhaps in 30 years, we're having to put some real brain power about this problem set. The notion and utility of sea power on the global stage is, of course, not new, for the Royal Navy. But this is also, I suppose, partly about renewing the muscle memory of operating more persistently to all corners of the globe, whilst also adapting to the new operating environment, not least the increasing threats, and so well articulated by my panel colleagues. So the Royal Navy really is transforming pretty quickly. And I think if I had to put it to 4 areas, it's adding its weight in terms of understanding the evolving threats, being out there across the globe and trying to get that intelligence picture really set. Building and reinforcing our alliances and partnerships. I think we've been very centric on NATO in the last 30 years, and now we're having to widen our aperture, certainly from the maritime flank. Remaining credible in terms of fighting power, and I'll come back to that in a minute, to underpin our strategic deterrence. But also contributing to a strong and consistent narrative for HMG about what we're doing and why. And I think the Navy has a big role to play in that narrative. But let me come back. I think we're well down track in starting to understand how we're going to shape the Royal Navy operation to meet that strategic picture. We're realigning our posture to optimise our numbers. Wouldn't we love having a much bigger fleet? I'd like to have 50 frigates, but we only have a certain limited capacity. So for me, it's all about optimising the fleet. The Secretary of State talked about availability, and we're doing much work there. How we're going to deliver effects and evolving our ways of operating that best meets the challenge of what is essentially a multipolar competition. And of course, what we mean by sub-threshold and grey zone, but also critically. Sir Henry Leach would recognise this 1982 being ready for where suddenly we have that black swan event and we trip into conflict when deterrence fails or there is a miscalculation. At the end of the day, my fleet as a Royal Navy Fleet Commander is all about committing violence to the enemy when ordered. But the Navy is also looking at its global footprint, how we train, how we maintain forces abroad, how we generate forces, defining how, to where, and when we pulse our strike groups, that sort of classic power projection thing, and also increasing our forward presence elements across the globe. And of course, how we're going to support them. Everyone forgets support. Support's critical through smarter contracts and also our logistical nodes, such as Gibraltar and Duncan. So for me, it's boiling down to three main buckets, if you like, of activity. Firstly, meeting our responsibilities in the North Atlantic for homeland defence. That remains my centre of gravity, of course, with our nuclear deterrence at its heart. Secondly, regular pulsing of maritime task groups, just like Steve Morehouse's Carrier Strike Group, as a power projection tool. And thirdly, what that forward presence actually looks like with our forward and ready ships and our littoral response groups. So for me, conceptually, this will see a shift from a scheduled approach, which we've really got into in the last 20 or 30 years, back to employing our forces, our maritime forces, in a much more diffuse and what I call a flexible operate posture, where forces can be generated and cross that line of departure as trained formed bodies, go out there, seizing opportunities across a much broader set of missions and tasks, across a much wider area. I mean, maybe the Indian Ocean or the Indo-Pacific. And in that sense, we need to become, again, masters of disaggregation, but retain the ability to quickly coalesce should the need arise for concentration of force. Of course, fighting power from my side is an amalgam of three factors: physical, conceptual, and moral. And we've heard much this morning already about the physical aspects, new carriers, first-class frigates and destroyers, new APVs, a reinvigorated commando force, increasing autonomous capabilities, and so on. But of course, critical on that also is the moral component, building confidence back in our personnel, that they're confident about wielding that equipment. But lastly, about the conceptual piece, and touching again on what Samantha and Angus were saying, is that how do we blend now the maritime flank into the multi-domain integrated future that we must lever into? And of course, I think the maritime is unique in all domains, is that we're the domain that can host and enable all the other domains at the same time. And we intend to fully exploit that attribute on the global stage. And of course, the steady return of importance to maritime has been sped up through the pandemic, I think. The closure of land borders and the reliance on shipping saw the fragility of the shipping container industry exposed as demand exceeded global supply, causing a huge global shortage. And again, I hate to be a cliche officer, but we're again reminded about the criticality of the lifeblood of sea routes and sea lines of communication, and the access to which must be protected. And I think the Royal Navy, if I was to be fairly critical, I think we forgot that in the last 20, 30 years. We got used to acting with impunity. There was no particular state threats to those slocks. But I think that's over. We got definitely into an area where we were generating ships and units on a single mission, one ship to one task line. And I think that was too binary. And now, as we look to be a much more flexible operate posture, we're going to have to go back to the era where we expect ships to do an awful lot more on one pulse out, or when we're further abroad. So in conclusion, exciting. We're generating a lot of conceptual thinking down here, so we can do that knitting in with wider government objectives. The threats of today and tomorrow have never been more complex. I mean, I know it's yet again another cliched statement, but it's true. And the rise of state powers, not least resurgent Russia, and of course we watch the rise of China in the maritime with real interest. And they seek to unbalance us, compete with us, and we must be ready to be very clever about how we wield our maritime forces as we go forward. The Royal Navy has absolutely focused investment on a modern, highly trained, motivated and resource fleet, which will deliver global agility. There's no doubt about that. But I look forward to hearing the thoughts, responses and questions of my esteemed colleagues and friends here today. So that's my opening pitch, and thank you very much, Nick.
Admiral Kidd, thank you very much for that contribution. And we've now heard perspectives, linked, integrated, but certainly subtly different perspectives from UK participants here. I'd now like to cross the channel because many people would say that the United Kingdom and France are condemned to share many things, including their relative scale, but also the fact that they both have a global perspective and have globally deployable navies, but also potentially subtly or significant different approaches. And I'm going to test that postulation right now by turning to our next panelist, and that is Alice Guitton, who is Director General for International Relations and Strategy, the Ministry of the Armed Forces of France, and ask her to make her contribution. Thank you very much.
Hello, good afternoon to all, and many thanks for having me today. And obviously, it's not only a privilege, but also very difficult for me to speak after so many interesting points of view expressed by good colleagues in London, and seize the opportunity to say hello to both Angus, Samantha, and to you, Admiral. I must say that you mentioned a number of aspects that were indeed at the core of my own keynote speak intervention, and I will focus on additional elements, more specific elements, also building on the strategic update that we released at the beginning of this year. Obviously, I would say that perhaps just like the UK, France too is an island nation. We have overseas territories in the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian Oceans, in the warm waters of the Caribbean and Mediterranean, to the colder ones of the Antarctic. And obviously, just like the UK, again, France is a global security actor. And maritime security has become obviously of the utmost importance on the global scene, not only because this is at immediate Europe's doorsteps with a number of challenges from the north of the Atlantic, where we have to secure, obviously, together with the UK, our deterrence, but also the Mediterranean Sea, where we have seen growing ambiguity taking place, and right to the Black Sea. And of course, I would also expand to what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, in the Red Sea, and down to the Indian Ocean, to the Mozambique Channel. So beyond, obviously, the Indo-Pacific is one of the major areas where we focus our attention today, because this is where strategic competition is exacerbated, and also because for the world trade in itself, you probably know the South China Sea concentrates a third of the world's maritime commercial activity, and that testifies to the importance of making sure that freedom of access in this area remains preserved. But there are also other regions where a country like France will dedicate a lot of attention, just like, for instance, the Gulf of Guinea. And Angus, you were also referring to that, but let me highlight perhaps a few points. What do we see there? Seafarers have been facing higher risks for their lives in the past few years due to piracy, armed robbery at sea, and regional states have to deal with multiple challenges, both by climate change and also difficulties in managing maritime resources, marine resources. So if you add on top of that the terrorist threat that is focusing a lot on forces, resources, and capacities, you have a very difficult picture to address. But along the persistence and extension of maritime criminality, we know that the world is also experiencing new kinds of challenges, which go far beyond economic competition. Obviously, the increased strategic competition at sea is in everybody's mind, not only because of what China is doing in the South China Sea, or because of what is happening in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also because of what we may see from Nigeria in the Gulf of Guinea or in other places. And it's an additional form of, I would say, lawfare applied to the maritime domain. And that means that indeed, the maritime domain has been constantly, increasingly affected by the notion of gray zones. these areas, you know, where international regulations and norms can be challenged and twisted and finally torn apart. And the global commons have become an easy field where this kind of activities can take place, usually using hybrid tools. And we know that as far as the maritime domain is concerned, these gray zones generally result in contested maritime limits and boundaries, in misinterpretation of economic exclusive zones, and honestly, in most cases, this is deliberate, where in situations, more specifically, where you see coastal states unable to enforce their own sovereignty and calling for assistance. So the temptation is high to unilaterally claim areas, impose local rules, and if nothing is done, honestly, we will be facing more and more situations of fait accompli, and these situations may become quickly a fait accepté, a forcibly accepted situation. So I suppose countries like the UK, like France, attached to the credibility of international law and multilateralism, cannot accept such a weakening of these fundamentals. I mentioned strategic competition, I mentioned gray zones. I would have to mention also what is happening in terms of threats emerging, affecting the seabed. I think here again, what we observe is the setting for power struggles, what we call seabed warfare, with the key issue of submarine cables in particular. And here again, this is extremely sensitive, but there is a need to organize coordination and cooperation among close allies. So the new and worrying fact is that we see naval forces more and more aggressively involved, thus increasing the possibilities of incidents at sea. And we have to also think about innovative ways, mechanisms to reduce tensions, to de-escalate, building on situational awareness. So what is our response to all these different challenges and threats? Perhaps looking at France's key objectives from the Ministry for Armed Forces, I would say, obviously, permanent member of the UN Security Council, founding member of the European Union, NATO ally, can only, of course, call for the promotion of the commonly agreed and long-standing regulations of the UNCLOS, which means that disputes must be solved through dialogue in a legal framework. This is at the core of our Indo-Pacific strategy. This is at the core of our efforts in support of many different multilateral and regional formats. And honestly, we look with concern at what may be developed in the context of the ASEAN framework, especially in terms of code of conduct in the maritime domain, and how this new norm may be different from UNCLOS and create a different custom. When we see international law not respected, let me say it frankly, we are not just there to say words or to pronounce statements. We will act, and taking action means that we will continue deploying assets. And it's not only about exerting presence in a non-escalatory way again, but it's also about having political weight and improving stratcom around those deployments. And that can only be built with partners and through tailored approaches. Looking at the Caribbean, Angus mentioned what we were doing together with the Dutch, because we are all concerned about what may happen there, natural disasters, or in response to the COVID crisis and the needs that have emerged. We are also doing similar efforts in the Strait of Hormuz. You know about the European-led Maritime Awareness Mission in the Strait of Hormuz, EMASO. In the Indo-Pacific, obviously, in order to protect our nearly 2 million nationals, French nationals in this region, and more than 9 million square kilometers of EEZ, in the Indo-Pacific, we continue and we reaffirmed our commitment to deploy more than 7,000 military personnel in the region, Navy vessels, aircraft capable of patrolling, intervening throughout the area on short notice. But also in the Gulf of Guinea, where I'm pleased to see that France and the UK are addressing this issue jointly and trying also to build excellent cooperation with Denmark, growingly interested in addressing this issue. I think it's good here to see that our cooperation and our support to the maritime industry is increasing. So to conclude, I would say that there are three main areas regarding maritime security in which we can improve. First, sovereign capacities. Let's start by homeworks. They have to be developed. I think the integrated review provides a good answer to that question about the future of maritime capabilities in the UK. We have taken similar commitments on a national basis in the context of the military planning law. And what does it mean, sovereign capacities? It means having the right means to ensure the security of maritime spaces under national jurisdiction. We have to start there. It includes also understanding the environment and therefore developing maritime domain awareness and being able, on the basis of confidence, to exchange information, to exchange intelligence. But also being able, just as it was mentioned by Samantha as well, the need to connect the different assets and including to make sure that we have an integrated approach, which means space capabilities as well, multi-domain coordination, and obviously a whole of a government approach to the hybrid threats that may emerge. Secondly, international laws have to be known, and I think perhaps we have to do more in terms of explanations, trying to share our understanding of what is international law, and then, of course, strictly obeyed. This is about defending the rules-based international order. And thirdly, enhanced regional cooperation, which will remain essential, fundamental to settle the disputes peacefully and address raising concerns like the environmental security ones. Only this global vision, if I may say so, will enable us, including jointly the UK and France, to combine the protection of the maritime interests of sovereign nations, sharing similar values, principles, with the freedom of the global commons. Letting the security balance be disrupted for any reason would be a mistake with dramatic consequences on the flow of goods, people, information, and therefore on global stability and prosperity. So to say it in a nutshell, I think regarding maritime security, we should apply the 3I. We have to develop an integrated approach. We have to preserve interoperability, and we have to be inclusive in terms of partnerships so that we can build over time the proper network to ensure stability and security. I hope I was not too long, and I'm looking forward to questions as well. So back to you, Nick.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was excellent. A tour d'horizon, both from a geographical perspective, but also in terms of the spectrum of issues and to some extent potential approaches and solutions. As our final panelist, I'm now going to turn for an academic perspective, having hopefully digested some of what has gone before in terms of the comments of the panelists up to now, but also with his own views on the challenges and opportunities that this competitive age present from a geostrategic point of view for the maritime domain. We'll turn now to Dr. David Blagdon, who is Senior Lecturer in International Security, the University of Exeter. David, over to you.
Right, thanks very much, Nick. It's quite august company to be in, the academic at the end sort of waving their fist at the sky after all the policymakers have said how things actually are. But I will try not to be too contrarian, but just contrarian enough. Okay, so I wanted to think about this competitive age and where it comes from, since that was part of the title of this plenary, and what that then means for the maritime. So my starting point, I want to think about the waning of American unipolarity and the return of functional multipolarity. And when I say functional multipolarity, I mean China, Russia, these states aren't going to be naval peers of the United States anytime soon. The United States concentration of naval power is greater than any ever before seen. But functional multipolarity in terms of there now being powers again out there in the system that can contest and deny American preferences. You know, I'd say Western preferences, but it's Western brackets, American-led preferences in crucial regions of the world. In China, in Russia, perhaps down the road India, although India is obviously a different kind of power in various ways. So thinking about this return of functional multipolarity. Now, competition, this competitive age that the plenary is thinking about, follows in such a world, not necessarily because others are bad or greedy, although they might be. You know, if you're sitting in Russia, then NATO looks like a revisionist, aggressive actor that's continually expanding and is very powerful. Whereas if you're sitting in Ukraine or Estonia, Russia might be the actor that looks greedy or malevolent. So I don't necessarily want to take a call on whether these powers are bad or greedy or anything like that. They might be, but rather competition follows in such an age from lots of powers seeking to protect and advance their interests in a system in which no one else will do it for them, basically. So this is what multipolarity looks like. And this will have big implications for the UK, right, as sort of primus inter pares of American allies, a major power in its own right, but also a subordinate cog in American grand strategy, if that makes sense. We're a major power that have chosen to subordinate ourselves to an even greater power because of certain benefits that come with that, although subordination is itself uncomfortable sometimes, and we sometimes want to put some distance in there. So big implications for the UK of this return of multipolarity, because many features of the post-Cold War international system, post-Cold War international politics that we've come to take as given, in many ways have been consequences of that unipolar moment, of that extreme concentration of American power. So when we think about our scope for humanitarian intervention and our preference for enforcing our preferred norms, when we think about the focus on counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency that prevailed through that era, when we think about the increasing efforts to regulate international politics through rules and institutions, you know, what people would call juridification, you know, so trying to make politics more rule-bound. Many of these actually followed from that extreme concentration of Western brackets American power. And all of those things are now in flux. So I want to talk about some big corollary implications for UK maritime strategy. So going from that competitive age that came about with the economic rise of China and the recovery of Russia and everything else, and sort of cascade it down to the maritime domain. So the first point I want to make is that the presumed Western command of the commons, in inverted commas, is passing. So when we look back to the work of 20 years ago on hegemony, Western hegemony, American hegemony, by people like Barry Posen, one of the things they pointed to was the command of the commons, the ability of one power and its allies to command not so much within other states' territories, but the commons that went in between air, sea, and space. And that is now passing. So that has big implications for what the sea actually is in international politics, going from being a highway for power projection, if you like, a sort of benign Western-controlled lake that we could use as a highway for our foreign policy, to itself needing to be something that is competed for all over again. I think this will have big implications for UK force posture. If we look at how UK force posture has evolved, the reduction in the number of high capability escorts, the reduction in the number of SSNs, whilst continuing to preserve power projection type forces. If you were to point to imbalance in UK naval forces now, you'd say we still have a lot of power projection capability, but less capability for actually contesting and winning sea control in the first place. That cascades over to things as well, like munitions fit. So when we look at vessels that are fitted for but not with, or that have vertical launch silos transporting fresh air around the world, to be a little snarky about it. So when we think about munitions fit, when we think about combat radius, you know, can those F-35Bs operating from a carrier actually extend the combat radius out such that the carrier is secure? You know, in terms of do they actually have adequate standoff munitions, or are we relying on aircraft that can get overhead and drop bombs, which was fine when you were bombing Iraq, to put it crudely, but might not be fine if you're trying to contest control of the North Atlantic or the Western Pacific. Reliance on potentially disruptible comms networks, you know, a very beautiful and elegant network-enabled warfighting construct, but in which peer or near-peer powers might say, hang on a second, these people are really vulnerable to, or are very reliant on their networks, and things like that. I suppose another way of thinking about this is having spent years lamenting others' rise of anti-access area denial capabilities, whether we've let our own anti-access and area denial capabilities become somewhat neglected. I think the United States Navy's idea of distributed lethality would be worth the UK looking at in this regard. So thinking about how it can actually increase the lethality of every unit that is out there, such that we aren't presuming this neat demarcation between presence type tasks, which are assumed to be benign, and fighty type tasks, which we assume will happen in neatly controlled places at times of our own choosing, which was fine in the unipolar moment, maybe not now. This point also has implications for the grey zone, which we're currently obsessed with, but people can pick that up in Q&A if they want to, because I don't want to take too long. So my second big point, which will be a little bit more contentious, is that this thing we call the rules-based liberal order, the rules-based international order, was largely an artifact of Western dominance. So the 2015 National Security Strategy said rules-based 30 times. The most recent integrated review said the rules-based order is being contested, but still says rules 27 times. I think we need some recognition of who those rules were made by, whose interests they were designed to serve, and did the powers that made them even obey them completely themselves, right? So the fact that a more realistic view might be that the rules-based liberal order is really our foreign policy preferences, and others might have alternative preferences and now have the power to contest them. Which isn't to say that's right or wrong. It isn't to say our foreign policy preferences are bad. They may well have a moral or a good normative base to them, but they are basically our preferences, which for a while we were able to say were rules. I think the harder choice for us now in a multipolar era is going to be ranking those preferences by A, how important they are, and B, our ability to positively affect them. So this isn't to say drop an adherence to international law or stop thinking that international law is important, or rules or treaties or whatever. But we might need some recognition that all states contest and resist rules that aren't in their favor, including ourselves, right? You know, a UN body has just said Diego Garcia is an illegal colonial possession. You know, that's not that it's right or wrong. The UN is a domain of politics, and we think it's not illegal, and other people think it is illegal. So rules are not apolitical things that fell nicely out of the sky. They are made by politics to suit others' power and preferences. States contest and resist rules that aren't in their favor, and we should only pay a certain level of cost to defend a principle. So we may want to keep those rules intact, but we are not, for example, willing to fight a nuclear war with China over the treatment of Uyghurs, for example. So there does have to come a point where you recognize that rules are nice things. If you can enforce your foreign policy preferences, that's good. But a multipolar system will make it harder. And my third point that sort of follows then from this is that we need some cold realism about what we can and can't do in the maritime domain. So symbolic posturing, tokenistic role performance, if you want to call it that, went unpunished in a unipolar era when the sea was essentially a benign highway for our foreign policy, which was something we did at range to others. But competitive multipolarity, by contrast, demands credibility in what we choose to do, or to not do it at all, if we're going to do it non-credibly, incredibly. Credibility is a function of power and resolve, i.e. how much capacity do we have to bring about a favoured outcome, and do we care enough to bear the costs that go with bringing about that favoured outcome. So we need more capability than unipolarity required, which is good, and the government is now giving the Navy that. The Navy plus broader maritime forces, obviously the RAF is also involved in this. So we need that extra capability in terms of numbers of platforms and the capability of those platforms, like I was just talking about. But we also need to be smart in choosing where we commit forces, and when doing so, to do it in sufficient concentration to fulfill the interests at stake. So if that's a really benign present task, then an OPV may indeed be sufficient capability to fulfill that tasking. But once you start to get into slightly more contentious things, like saying we're going to do rule enforcement in the Western Pacific, then we do need to think where we commit or whether to do it at all. So that's the subject of a separate plenary this afternoon. You know, obviously, the sort of UK impetus to deploy east of Suez will receive scrutiny then. But one thing I would just ask you to consider is possibilities of entanglement and escalation, risks of penny packeting that the British government was very worried about in the 60s, and the opportunity costs of forces being in one place and not in others. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks very much.
David, thank you very much for rounding things off for us. A lot to chew over in all of that, and as a result of that, we've already got a lot of questions for the panelists. So I'm regrettably not going to be able to exercise my traditional right as a moderator to pitch in first. I'm going to go straight to the first question from Will Evans at Pembroke College, and it's for Angus specifically. The UK is investing in its commitment to NATO. To what extent does the alliance itself need to modernise to accommodate the latest UK defence thinking, and particularly regarding maritime operations?
Thanks, Will. So I think, actually, I think the direction that we are going in our thinking about maritime power is, and not accidentally, pretty consistent with the way NATO itself is starting to think about things. So, you know, NATO has been thinking quite hard about how does it do the command and control of the Atlantic? How do you generate effective command and control over the entire European theatre and its maritime dimension? It's also thinking about how it develops a more active posture. So what's called the DDA, the concept for the defence and deterrence of the North Atlantic area, that is a bit of kind of military thinking, which is challenging NATO and its partner nations, its allied nations, to think about how do you shape the environment around you to maintain deterrence through a mixture of engagement and exercising, building capacity. So I think a lot of the trends that we are grappling with, you know, not really surprisingly, are actually very consistent with the way NATO is going. As Secretary of State mentioned, you know, we, or was it first? I can't remember. You know, we have made clear that one of the two carriers will always be available to the NATO Readiness Initiative. So I think we're the only nation which has committed a carrier strike group to the NRI, and that, you know, that means we will keep one of the carriers at a certain level of readiness available to respond to NATO tasking. So I think it's pretty consistent, actually, and it's about getting NATO itself to respond to a more competitive age, including thinking a bit more about what does the rise of China mean for NATO.
Thanks, Angus. A couple of, as I think was predicted, grey zone was going to come up in the questions, and there are a couple which I'll mash together. One from Lee Willett and one from Lieutenant Commander Ian Guild. Lee's asking particularly Vice Admiral Kidd and Angus thoughts on how the nature of grey zone threats the UK and allies face are different in different maritime regions, and how maritime power, force and capabilities provide flexibility. And Lieutenant Commander Guild similarly asks, is the Royal Navy becoming tooled up sufficiently with forward deployed OPVs of the right sort to make that kind of contribution? I might also bring in both Alice Guitton and Samantha Job from a policy perspective. Alice, you mentioned the concerns about this incrementalism and fait accomplis becoming fait acceptes. Are we gearing up enough on the policy front, or is there a policy deficit in dealing with these? I'd like to ask you both to think about that, but I'll go first to Admiral Kidd on the grey zones.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and thanks for those questions. On my word, if we had £1 for every moment we spent thinking about grey zone, we'd all be millionaires. For me, it's we're learning, there's no doubt about that, but it's about applying the right spanner to the nut in question. Look, the grey zone is, or the sub-threshold zones I prefer to call it, is diffuse and it's pretty broad in structure. And it's about understanding the blend and the balance of actual activity and forces you want to apply to any particular element of the sub-threshold, acknowledging, of course, that you're right, Lee, that different geographic areas present different challenges in the sub-threshold, whether it's an ecological one in the new marine park off the Pitcairn Islands, or it's about counter-narcotics in the Caribbean, or counter-illegal activity in the Gulf of Guinea, or indeed counteracting a massed fishing fleet around your aircraft carrier in the Indo-Asia-Pacific area. So for me, it's about identifying very quickly about how to operate and influence the various actors in those different geographic areas, which means applying some thought. And I talked earlier about where we're going in the Royal Navy, about providing an operational advantage centre, which we're investing in Portsmouth this year, to particularly start thinking about how we can apply our units abroad, particularly in making the best of the grey zone opportunities. So more intellect, less brutishness, but you know, we could talk about specific examples, and I'll pick up on, just to finish off on the batch 2 OPVs on that last point, is that sometimes you have to calibrate which spanner to use. And I'll suggest that in this careful calibration in the grey zone, you have to be very clear about the influence and the effects you want to place on the opposition's perception of what you're doing and why. And that is why the balance is so key. So batch 2 OPVs have a use in themselves, that they're not frigates. Putting a frigate in a particular area may have an effect that you don't wish to go to. So I think it's all about applying the right tool to the right nut, if that makes sense.
Thanks. Angus.
Thanks. Well, I'll just give one kind of vignette, which is the activity that we and several other NATO navies have been conducting in the Arctic and the High North over the last 12 months or so. And you know, what are you seeking to achieve when you do something like that? Well, firstly, you're seeking, as Jerry would say, to demonstrate that you can operate, that you've got the capabilities, the expertise, the morale, as Jerry put it, to operate in that part of the world, and to demonstrate this is not a part of the world where only Russia, for example, operates. Secondly, I think you're demonstrating a willingness to work with allies, including respecting, you know, their political concerns. So we work very closely with Norway, for example, to understand what kind of messaging they want or don't want to be to put out in that part of the world. Thirdly, it's an opportunity to sort of make points about some of the rules, and Alice may want to talk about the High North Passage, which the French Navy did, which was a really good way of demonstrating that, you know, we regard the Arctic Ocean as international waters, and we should be able to transit through it when you can, which is obviously a kind of more a physics question than a policy question. And to go to the very good points that David made, it's also about being realistic. You know, nobody's saying the Arctic Ocean is an entirely NATO lake that only we can operate in. Of course, Russia has its very legitimate interests in that part of the world. So, I mean, I always say this at think tank events, but I do think, you know, grey zone maneuver sometimes involves manoeuvring big grey things, that at the moment is a really interesting part of the world in terms of finding that balance that David was talking about, balance between being reasonably assertive, as the Defence Secretary said earlier, not provocative, not escalatory, but kind of confident, and you know, we can do this, and if we have to, we will, and we'll do it with allies and send carefully calibrated messages.
It's not a matter of grey and white, as if you've read the Food for Thought paper, you'll understand the reference. Madame Guitton, do you have any thoughts on what I posed in terms of policy?
No, thank you, because this is a critical question, and honestly, we have put in place a task group, an internal working group to try addressing more precisely lawfare in the field of maritime security and how it is used. In terms of policy actions that should be developed, I see 4 levels of approaches. The first one is, of course, to be able to identify clearly who is using those kind of the use of law in order to assert interest in the maritime domain. So attribution is key, and even more than attribution, there is the anticipation of what may be done as a next step in order to prevent more offensive actions. So prevention and deception are key in order to avoid indeed situations moving from fait accompli to fait accepté. I think exchange of intelligence is also, of course, crucial, and relying on intelligence sharing and space imagery, sharing information on that basis, and analysis of what is going on, the pattern of behavior of different competitors is obviously crucial. But more than just assessing what is the situation, having the mapping of the different levels of use of lawfare in the field of maritime security, I think there are also domains where the law of the sea doesn't really cover the new domains. And I would perhaps mention 4 areas where we see the existing law of the sea, international law, not really addressing the upcoming challenges. The first one is, what is, as far as surface and manned vessels are concerned, and submarines, how the international law applies to those deployments. This is put in question in many different cases, and I will not dwell on that. I'm sure, Admiral, you may certainly have more experience than I do in this domain, but I see that as a critical area. The second one is, I mentioned it, is seabed warfare and seabed more specifically, and smart cables. This is not really addressed by international law of the sea. And finally, from a different perspective, but just to throw this idea on the table, but we see, and this is certainly appropriate, a lot of efforts to protect biodiversity, including in the oceans. But obviously, it also poses a number of challenges to operational deployments, and we will have to reconcile those 2 objectives in the long term. So to cut a long story short, I would say 2 different pillars. The first one is about anticipation and prevention before, and that means having a good picture of what kind of actors at what point, what are their intentions, and the evolution of patterns, and how we can indeed reaffirm through the deployment of our assets a deterrence presence and deter further offensive measures. And secondly is making sure that we continue consolidating resolutely the law of the sea. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Samantha, do you have anything to add on that?
Thank you. I agree with an awful lot of what's been said. If you look at the themes in the integrated review, it talks through state threats, it talks through resilience, it talks through science and tech. All of these come together in this area. And if we think through the era that we're in and with the era that is coming, it is about an increase in state threats, but it's also a change in the nature of conflict. Most of those states don't want a conflict. So what they're trying to do is win a war without ever fighting, or change the rules with, in the fait accompli style that Alice is referring to. So we need to be aware of that. We need to think about how we respond to that. And I would absolutely agree with Admiral Kebb when he's talking about any of our activity needs to think about what they are trying to achieve. It needs to think about how we influence that. It needs to think about what we are doing and why, the effect that we're trying to create, the cognitive effect as well as the practical effect. And some of what we can do in that area is on the international side can be about the shining a light, as he says, sort of witnessing what happens, drawing attention to what happens, making it visible for everyone to be aware of, is in the maritime domain quite often, it's naval assets that are doing that. One of the things that we can do is capacity building and capability building of other seafaring nations or island states who don't have that capacity for themselves, but we can help them understand maritime domain awareness. We can help them understand what the law of the sea currently says, and we can help, stand with them when they shine that light or want to shine that light themselves. So there's a range of different activities. I think the policy community is thinking about all of these. It's thinking about how to have a deterrent effect in this sort of area, how to be ready for the sorts of activities that we see, how to encourage our own societies and thought-leading community to think about this. And the reason I say that is if you think about what is different about grey zone activity to overt activity, is that it is not as visible to our own populations, our own the democracy's tool of using the media to educate ourselves, to have think tank events, to have Parliament talk about this sort of thing. That's the space we need to get into so that our own societies understand what the grey zone or sub-threshold hybrid activity is going on right now against us and our assets, and to build that community of kind of policy support and political support, small p, for the sorts of activities we need to take in response. Thanks.
Many thanks. Amongst our delegates, Admiral Duncan Potts has raised his hand. So if I could ask Duncan, can you make your intervention? Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Nick. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Brilliant. Great, thank you very much. And can I firstly thank all the panel actually for giving a really diverse view of the utility of maritime power in the new world order. And it seems there's almost an insatiable demand for everything. And in particular there, I was very struck by David Blagden's final comments where he brought it all together. And it seems that the grand strategic game changer is really this shift from a unipolar world and the rise of China out there. And when you combine that with Britain's ambition, global ambition, tilt to the Indo-Pacific and everything, it seems that that condition has a profound impact. In the first session this morning, the language was almost quite different. It was all about how the tonnage was growing, availability was improving, but it's only now we're just getting on to capability here. And I just welcome the panel's view on, as we look to the future, where we want persistent engagement all over the world, in the NATO and the Indo-Pac area, what are the capabilities that would be really needed and we should look forward to, especially in the new surface and submarine fleet that will provide that? And I'll give a clue to my thought, is that capability seems to be about something that affects your opponent's calculus, but also buys you influence with your allies that are so important as we go forward. So I'll be really interested in the panel's view. Thank you very much indeed.
I think, as I'm, apart from anything else, conscious of time, I'm going to zero in on Admiral Kidd and ask if he, on his shopping list, what comes top in terms of future capability with great utility.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, and good to hear Duncan on the line. You know, we talked before about capabilities, and it's not a frigate; it could be a hot air balloon, all those sort of things. It's about the full spectrum approach and how we want to affect audiences, because we all recognise that the rules of the game have changed. You know, we're not in a unified bipolar Cold War system. The number of actors is going up all the time. The number of threat sets are going up all the time. And so for the maritime domain, albeit nested in the MDI, multi-domain integrated world we're going into, it seems to me that the problem set is going to be getting more diffuse and about how we balance of the capabilities that we wish to field on a persistent basis. But for me, it's all about understand is the capabilities we must focus on, because if you don't understand the operating environment you are in, whether it's in the cyber world or it's in the geographic world, the Gulf of Guinea or the Far East, you have to understand what is going on around you in order to decide and then act. In other words, have effect at the point that you wish it to be affected. So for me, I would invest in understand. Number two, you have to be credible. If you're not credible through strength, reach, persistence, and sustainment, quite frankly, you can't have effect on anyone. So credible in my mind means, I'm afraid to say, you have to look good and you have to be look powerful. And I would give an example that if you don't have a land attack or a strike capability worth its salt, then you can't claim to be a tier 1 navy. And if you can't do that, then I'm afraid to say that your power and your leverage all the way down through the sub-threshold is diluted. So I would very much say that you have to still be a tier 1 power and in terms of strike weaponry and so forth. And the last bit I'd say is about the intellectual capital, that we have to invest that and see that humans' intellectual capital is a capability in itself, a bit like command and control, but central to that is brain power. And so as we seek to send out our units and our people around the world to have this effects in the multi-domain world, we have to have a reach back into home base, into the UK, and we're investing a lot of the Royal Navy into an operational advantage centre here in Portsmouth to enable us to act in a much more agile, intellectual way, because we're going to be swapping people and units from one mission set to another very quickly. And that can be quite disorientating for commanders and crews across the world. So that for me, Duncan, is a very broad pitch about the key capabilities I would focus on in the future.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to keep you on the spot because I've got two questions that I'd like to squeeze in for you to round off. One from one of our future maritime strategists group, Major Cy Ward, and you may have touched on this already, and that's your perception on whether you think the Navy's in the right place as far as information activity in the sub-threshold, and whether there is a good enough capability to deliver on that. So that's one element to pick up from the strand that we've just been talking about. And on a completely different perspective, from Professor Sir Hugh Strawn, but I guess it probably goes to integration in some way, to Admiral Kidd, what about cooperating with the merchant fleet, especially given flag issues and the RN? Should there be more of that?
Yes, thanks, Hugh. It was always a bit of a hospital pass question, because of course we'll always say, yes, of course, you operate with the Merchant Marine very closely. And I think in the sub-threshold conversation, how we perhaps lever the Merchant Marine in the future is a really interesting question, and about the blend between warship and merchant ship as we move forward. But that's a whole different ballgame. But the bottom line is, I think the union between the merchant flank and the maritime and the military flank, I think diverged over the last 20, 30 years. I think mainly because we saw the global sea commons as a safe place to be. It was all very centric on land operations. And I think, quite frankly, we didn't have sufficiency of conversation between the merchant flank and the military flank. But that is definitely changing. And I think we saw, the conversations recently about choke points and about the more malign actors now affecting the Merchant Marine as much as the military. So I think that conversation has been reinvigorated, is my view. I think on the first question of information operations, another completely a huge bucket of issues and factors. That's a huge question, and I think comes back to the point of my earlier bit about intellectual. I mean, information operations and outreach is a massive bailiwick. That's about shaping your environment so that you can influence all the actors in that space to give you the upper hand. I mean, that's actually, we don't want to fight fairly. And I think information operations is conducting timely and appropriate audience, actor and adversary analysis. Coming back to my point about understanding your environment is critical to enable you then to plan and integrate information activity and outreach appropriately, and then supporting and delivering it within pre-designated boundaries, whether that's legal or indeed in physical or indeed in technological terms, and supporting partners across government upstream and post-conflict institutional developments and reforms. That's also an important part of that. And lastly, collecting, creating, disseminating digital and wider media content in support of designated tasks will get increasingly important in this fused media world we're in. You know, we have to absolutely understand how we can create and disseminate the digital space and digitize the maritime flank is one of our key things of naval transformation. And I think that's all I want to say, really. It's a huge issue. We could talk for hours on it.
Thank you very much for fielding those. That's great. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, as they say. It's been a very rich session, I think, and I thank all the panelists for their contributions. I thank those who, amongst our delegates and audience, putting questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but I much appreciate that. So I'll draw events to a close for this session, although I would also advertise that as we break for lunch here, over the lunch period, available on this feed at 12:45 and then another at 1300, are two pre-recorded video vignettes on innovation with Ben Hudson, the Chief Technology Officer for BAE Systems, and Alex Zeno, who's Executive Vice President, Business Development and Future Programs Defence for Rolls-Royce. So they will be coming along on this feed for those who are remote and contemplating their lunch, and I think well worth looking at. I will draw things to a close with great thanks to everybody, and we'll be reconvening again in plenary at 13:45. So with that, thanks to everyone, both who provided interventions from the floor, but also to our panelists, and I think both remotely and in the normal way. Let's offer that thanks. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be talking with Ben Hudson, the Chief Technology Officer for BAE Systems, for the first Sea Lord Sea Power Conference 2021. And I'd like to just start, Ben, by getting your take from your perspective on the potential impact of the technology upheavals, disruptive or otherwise, that we seem to see coming down the track now, particularly in terms of the maritime domain. What, in your view, would you say are the game changers that we should be looking for?
Thank you very much for the invitation, firstly, Nick, to join you here. A really good discussion, I think, at a pivotal point in time as we look to sort of the changing character of warfare and what's occurring. And I think first and foremost, we've got to think about the challenges our customers face, the MOD and our global customers as well. And those that might face a NATO on the battlefield are really evolving very quickly. And some of the new threats we're seeing is as the impact of autonomous systems across all domains. Really interesting when you have a look at some of the national parades on some of those nations and what they're looking at for the future. Armed, high-speed, long-range autonomous drones. We're seeing very large underwater autonomous systems, which is going to impact fleet security going forward. And then we see a rise really in space and the contested nature of space. I guess I believe that if heaven forbid it, there was another global war ever again, I think the first days of that global war will be fought in space. So the resilience of our space assets and over-reliance on networks is really important, and think about other ways to deliver those services, perhaps with non-space assets, or increase our resilience. So a lot to play for, I think, as we see this rapidly changing change in the character of warfare and the constant threat from sort of below the threshold of armed conflict in the cyber and electromagnetic domains. But equally, it's not all doom and gloom. There's some really interesting solutions being rolled out right now. We're doing some great work, I think, at the moment with the Royal Navy, thinking about autonomous systems and how they team with the platforms and the men and women in uniform right now and create combat mass and answer some of these questions. And I think we can also answer a big portion of what we need to do to improve our resilience in space and what some of those future solutions look like. Some things we're heavily investing in as a company right now.
That's a good gamut of potential issues out there. Could I raise one more that's been very much a talking point of late and seems to be coming down the track, and that's the issue, the threat of hypersonic systems, very high speed systems, and essentially what's the threat and what is the answer?
I mean, it's the new arms race, isn't it? So we've seen that switch over and really the US leaning forward on a lot of the solution space there. We see and know of some of the issues facing Australia, and we're investing through our Australian business in some hypersonic solutions at the moment, and partnering with the Australian government. And we see it here in Europe, really UK potentially being on the front lines. These aren't global threats, but they are very long range, 5,000 plus kilometres, and travelling at hypersonic speeds, Mach 5, Mach 7 plus. And so in a maritime environment, when you see them the first time, if you think about line of sight radar, you only have seconds to react. And the kinetic energy, as enormous as it is, even if you can counter that threat, you've still got a range of high velocity, high energy pieces coming towards you. So really for me, the answer is downrange, and we are working on looking at some of those solutions right now. So if you think about autonomous systems and how they might help, you've got to think about autonomous systems through the lens of doing things differently, not just replacing men and women with or taking them out of a system and having an uncrewed version of a traditional platform. But if you think about sense and effect, whether that's sense and effect in the air as part of a carrier strike group, or unmanned surface vessels with sensors on them that are well downrange and keeping effectors on platforms, you can get that early warning that you need. So manned, unmanned teaming, and solutions potentially like high altitude pseudo satellites, things like our Phaser 35, flying in a persistent way over a carrier group and looking for those telltale signs of hypersonics. But I also think space is part of this. Really one of the huge opportunities is to think about the application of new space technologies, small satellites, thinking about constellations, not just singular vulnerable satellites delivering reconnaissance or MilSatCom capabilities, but really creating that situation where a satellite constellation is accessed from the ops room of a carrier or a Type 26, and being able to provide that early warning and being able to see 1,000 nautical miles downrange in front of a carrier group to get the early warning required, instead of going back through a national strategic headquarters and then getting back out to the fleet. So I think new space is a big part of this, and something I think I'd love to see us do more with our customers globally and here in the UK, and really partner on some of these solutions. The solutions are there, I think, but there's a lot of work to be done to operationalise those. And I think there's some good cues in this too, in the command paper and the IR that we've seen recently.
Does that answer the question, the evolution in space, although it's going to be a high frontier confrontation zone? Is that going to be a solution to the issue out there that a lot of people are saying technologically an advantage for the future is being more networked and networking of systems across the board, and yet potentially we're also in an environment where we're going to have, at the very least, network degradation or network denial in terms of counter capabilities. How does that square?
When you look at that future battlefield, a network-enabled force, information advantage, as the MOD calls it, is fundamental to creating the combat power, really doing that multi-domain integration so that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. I don't think anyone in NATO can get away from the need to do that and really create that situation where 100 people can fight 1,000. We don't have the human scale that some of those that face NATO does. So it becomes one of resilience. If you accept the fact that information needs to be captured, analysed and moved around the battle space, it then becomes a question of resilience. And if you think about traditional space assets, a small number of satellites, highly bespoke and potentially vulnerable, and those becoming the backbone of a communication solution, maybe there are alternate ways to think about it with pseudo satellites, with low Earth orbit constellations, where you think just from an economic perspective that the cost to counter a satellite is more than what the satellite costs, then from an economics perspective alone, you have an advantage. Whereas at the moment, anti-satellite weapons are far cheaper than the large singular satellites that most of NATO use right now. So new space, I mean, we've seen a reduction in launch costs of 95%, and we've seen a 10x reduction in the size of satellites. You combine those two things together, and there is transformational capability possible from space to enable this future networking environment. I would also think that some of the traditional communications technologies that perhaps haven't been fully utilised to create beyond line of sight mesh networks are part of the solution as well. Thinking about HF communications and being able to communicate sort of 2,000 nautical miles downrange off the ionosphere. This is part of it. The ships use that today, and yeah, I think there's more opportunity to do that with other platforms as well. So yeah, a lot to play for.
In terms of the pace of technological change that we're seeing, people say that in terms of introducing innovation is not a destination, it's a mindset. This is going to be constantly renewing. In a world of partnerships and alliances, if you have, a key ally, say the United States, essentially steaming off over the horizon of innovation, how does that potentially affect interoperability, interchangeability, multinational mission capabilities? Are others going to struggle to keep up?
The scale of US investments is hard to keep up with, but NATO does need to do some work. I would think on making sure we've got appropriate standards interfaces to allow collaboration in interoperability. I mean, the US have acknowledged it themselves that multi-domain integration in their own forces is but part of the challenge, and the interoperability and integration of NATO or US allies throughout NATO is fundamentally part of their challenge as well. Does more need to be done? Yeah, I think so. And I suspect part of this is partnership between governments and industry. Companies like ours, and there are others as well, have good solid footprints in the US and in the UK, and can become part of that access to create that collaboration needed to look at sort of joint all-domain communication solutions that can be more than just a US-only solution. So yeah, we're up for those type of discussions to help, because yeah, we've got to bring NATO together. If you look at Trident Juncture and the activities back in 2018, NATO communications was one of the big challenges in that exercise up in Norway at that stage. And as we go towards the next big NATO exercise in a few years' time, yeah, we should all strive to see NATO do better on the interoperability and communications front. I think it'll be a constant challenge though. Interfaces, standards, and collaboration and partnership are the solutions there.
Ben, it's been great talking to you. That's been an interesting canter around many of the issues in terms of looking forward into the technological space in the future. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Really appreciate it, Nick, and have a good conference.
Hello, and it's a great pleasure to be talking to Alex Zeno, who is Executive Vice President, Business Development and Future Programs, Defence, Rolls-Royce, for the first Sea Lord Sea Power Conference 2021. Now, Alex, I guess sea power, the term, has a very particular connotation from your perspective. So in that context, and the expectation of dramatic technological change, what would you say are the really significant transformations, and where are they going to be in the future, do you think?
Pleasure to be with you today, ahead, as you say, of the first Sea Lord Sea Power Conference. And you rate, sea power. Power, as you say, core to that title, and a core part of what we see as a vital capability for the Royal Navy in the UK, but navies around the world, and blue ocean navies as they look to expand and grow their capabilities in the years ahead. And what we're seeing as we talk to various customers around the world is a desire for increased power. And that's driven by a number of factors. It's driven by the need for a larger suite of sensors, more powerful radars, more powerful capability on the ship that needs, higher number of megawatts and kilowatts. We're seeing top speeds in some of the frigates in the 30 knots plus, driving again the need for increased power just for maneuverability. And we're seeing it as people talk about the likes of directed energy and needing continuous power, and what some would call, the deep magazine, where it can be released continuously. So power above the surface is clearly moving to be more electric, more capable, and increasingly flexible. So that's an area we're focused on. In terms of how that is delivered, a couple of other elements that we're seeing. Customers looking for that, but with reduced crew, reduced manning, being able to have a smaller crew to run the ship, so more autonomy in those systems, better connectivity in terms of getting data from deployed assets around the world back to the engineers to make real-time decisions based on a more digital infrastructure. And in some cases, clearly, as you start to go under the surface, we're looking for totally unmanned underwater vehicles, where we're looking for long endurance power and some very different characteristics there, and in terms of creating maybe some smaller assets that can create mass around the above the surface fleet, and provide power that is enduring for days, if not months. So some really exciting areas, I think, looking out into the future.
Also bubbling up on the global agenda are things like concerns about the environment, climate change and the like. And also, dare I say it, the ripple effects of the pandemic and how that might change globalization and activities at sea. So squaring, desire for more power, more forward presence and all of that with that agenda as well. How does that work out? How is that going to work out in the future?
Everyone, I think it's very clear, is talking about net zero, whether it's net zero 2050. We just saw more recently, the Biden administration talking about bringing some of its projects and targets forward. We'd hear many customers talk about being operationally net zero by 2030 or the 2030s. So we absolutely see a role for power in terms of becoming clean in that time period, and we're putting an awful lot of effort into that. Specifically, if I look at Rolls-Royce, as we look to pivot to become a digitally led technology industrial for defence, that means things like synthetic fuel playing a much larger part. We're talking about some of our novel nuclear capabilities. So when you start to look at the capabilities we have in the UK, I think we're in a very unique position where you can put micro reactors, micro grids on some of the big ships alongside synthetic fuel capabilities, farms, for want of a better word, and you can actually create that fuel on the ship. So you start to create a very different opportunity if you could have a carrier strike group that didn't necessarily need all the solid support ships behind it to refuel it. You'll clearly need support in terms of other resources, but from a fuel perspective, imagine if that fleet could create its own fuel wherever it was in the world, ultimately improving resilience in that forward deployment. So I think we can see synthetic fuels playing a big part. Clearly there's efficiency. We still see the gas turbine as a vital power source in some of the frigates and carriers around the world. And for that, therefore, we need to make those more efficient. So there's an efficiency around the diesels and the gas turbines today. There's a move to synthetic fuel. And then in some of the underwater systems, we're talking about hydrogen fuel cells and very different power systems, which again meet that green agenda. So I think, to me, the two go hand in hand. Actually, turning to net zero can deliver greater resilience for our navies around the world. And as countries, as you say, talk about wanting to do that maybe indigenously, I think that's an opportunity for the UK to partner with some of its allies. These are not, I'm not going to pretend these are small capability programs, and the UK working with its allies around the world, I think has an opportunity to act as a leader and potentially a catalyst to drive some of those changes with its naval partners in Indo-Pacific and other areas globally.
Do you see all of this as it comes together? Is that going to change and to some extent challenge the relationships between defence on the one side and industry on the other? And also, given where the balance of a lot of the investments in these new technologies are between defence and the wider economy and the wider economic base?
There's a coming together of objectives here. I think a lot of countries, as we go through COVID and the challenges COVID is putting down on every government around the world, defence has the opportunity to be a key catalyst to the recovery in many nations. It has the opportunity to actually, in my view, be the shop window to some of these dual-use technologies that we've just talked about there, whether it be marinizing a gas turbine, some of the diesels that are in the current UK Navy and around the world. Actually, these are capabilities that are used either in the aerospace domain, in the diesel world, they're used in the commercial market, and synthetic fuels and hydrogen fuel cells and more automation all feed across both those sectors. So I think actually this is an opportunity for a whole of government approach where the defence domain can be that leader and can be the shop window to the wider economy and the other sectors in terms of showing the art of the possible. And that should provide the opportunity with good alignment between industry and governments for industry to invest, because clearly the return will come through scale, and some of that scale is outside the defence alone. But actually defence can take the first step and take the lead. And that's the exciting bit for me, is working together in partnership with militaries around the world to enable that roadmap over the coming decade.
And finally, sort of thinking through all of the things we've just talked about, do you have an idea in your mind, or could you sketch it out a little bit, how you think navies will look, I suppose? Will they look different in the future?
This is one of those where, it depends how far you look at, Nick. I absolutely believe, and it depends, what do you mean by look? Yes, I think they will be constitutionally, in terms of what constitutes a navy, different. Do you see a directed energy on a ship today? No. Do you see above the water and below the water unmanned systems creating scale today? No. Some of those capabilities are absolutely in the prototypes. Do we start to see some more large scale above the surface capabilities coming online? Yes. So I think we're going to see an evolution of the navies where we're going to see a much more interconnected digital capability across the Navy. We're going to see a very different mix of manned to unmanned systems to enable the continuation of mass. And we're going to see a real demand, therefore, for much more, I guess, open architecture to enable that interoperability, because very few nations, I would argue, have the scale of funding and ability to deliver the whole scale that is needed across a full Navy. So that, again, partnerships, as we're seeing on the Carrier Strike Group, as it departs later this month on its first tour, we're seeing a partnership, whether it's above the deck with the F-35Bs, a partnership between the US Navy and the UK, or whether it's allied ships being part of that Carrier Strike Group. So I think we'll see different compositions, different assets with a different set of capabilities across those, and for, as it says there, all ultimately needing power and power of a very different nature to what we have today. And for me, that's the opportunity to work together for industry and defence more collaboratively, and for the in the UK, for industry and the Royal Navy to work collaboratively to good effect in terms of international partnerships. And ultimately, as I said at the beginning, this is about enabling that recovery as we come out of COVID, using the defence skills, defence capabilities to enable, as the Prime Minister would say, the bounce back plan.
Well, Alex, I think that's a good place to end on. It's been very good talking to you for this year's first Sea Lord Sea Power Conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Been a pleasure.